By mid-2023, a silent shift had begun reshaping the future of oil and the global economy. OPEC Plus, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, announced aggressive cuts to oil production. This wasn't a simple market adjustment. It was a calculated move to pressure global markets, challenge major powers, and tighten control over the world's most important energy source. While the world was busy talking about AI and tech innovation, behind closed doors, real power moves were being made. Oil, often dismissed amid promises of clean energy, was quietly reclaiming its place at the center of the geopolitical chessboard. But this time, the game was far more complex. Cutting production meant one thing: less oil in the market, and less oil means higher prices. For Saudi Arabia and its allies, it meant billions of extra dollars. For the rest of the world, especially oil-dependent nations, it meant inflation, economic instability, and growing vulnerabilities. The United States reacted quickly. Strategic oil reserves were released to try to stabilize prices, but there was only so much Washington could do. At the same time, they pressured allies to boost production and scrambled to negotiate emergency deals with historically unstable nations. It was a silent race to hold on to energy influence. Meanwhile, Russia viewed the production cuts as a strategic weapon. By reducing the global supply, they increased their revenues, even under heavy Western sanctions triggered by the war in Ukraine. It was a way to fund conflict without making any major visible moves. OPEC's decision wasn't just about economics. It was a declaration of independence, a message to the world that the old players still held the strongest cards, and they weren't afraid to use them. But the consequences went far beyond the price of oil. Central banks were forced to quietly adjust their strategies. Strategic alliances shifted. Global influence battles reignited. A new cycle of power was being drawn, and those who fail to recognize this shift will be left watching from the sidelines, while the future of wealth and influence is decided. Before we dive deeper into this silent conflict that's shaping the destiny of billions, make sure to subscribe to Fortune Flow. True power never makes the headlines, but that's exactly where fortunes are built or lost. The impact of OPEC Plus production cuts was immediate. Within just a few weeks, oil prices surged to levels not seen since the early months of the war in Ukraine. Inflation, which was already a major concern for central banks, gained new momentum. Oil-dependent economies started to wobble. Transportation costs soared, basic goods became more expensive, and instability spread like wildfire. Saudi Arabia, the mastermind behind the cuts, quickly reaped the rewards. Export revenues surged, boosting its global position. But the benefits didn't stop there. For years, Saudi Arabia has been working to diversify its economy under the Vision 2030 plan. Higher oil prices became the perfect opportunity to supercharge those ambitions. More investments, more influence, and greater bargaining power in international negotiations. Meanwhile, the United States found itself in a tough spot. In a crucial pre-election year, the government needed to tame inflation without triggering a recession. Releasing strategic oil reserves was only a temporary fix. Behind the scenes, the real battle was unfolding. Diplomatic pressure on allies scrambling for alternative energy deals, and tense negotiations with historically unstable nations. It was a quiet but desperate effort to maintain global energy influence. China, always calculating, seized the moment. As the West struggled to cope with rising prices, Beijing accelerated deals with oil-producing countries, securing supplies at more favorable terms. A strategic move to further cement China's position as a global powerhouse. At the same time, Russia saw its strategy paying off. Even under heavy economic sanctions, Moscow managed to keep its energy revenues flowing, and with tighter global supply, it sold oil at favorable prices to strategic partners like China and India, building a silent network that challenged efforts to isolate it economically. The world was witnessing a new oil dance, where every move had massive consequences. And as global leaders raced to adapt, one truth became increasingly clear: whoever controls energy controls the future. But the most important shift was still ahead. Because beyond the geopolitical chess game, a deeper structural transformation of the energy market was unfolding, one that promises to redraw the global map of wealth and power for decades to come. While world leaders fought behind closed doors, An even quieter movement was reshaping the global energy market. Institutional investors, private banks, and sovereign wealth funds began rethinking their long-term strategies. Oil, once considered outdated in the age of renewable energy promises, was now being seen again as a strategic and highly profitable asset. Oil reserves, once viewed purely as economic assets, were increasingly treated as geopolitical weapons. Access to those reserves became a matter of national security. Countries rushed to strengthen bilateral agreements, offering economic advantages in exchange for guaranteed energy supplies. Discrete partnerships emerged between unlikely nations, bound not by ideology, but by the urgent need to secure the economic lifeline for the decades ahead. At the same time, the instability triggered by the OPEC+ cuts fueled a global race for alternative energy sources. European countries accelerated investments in wind, solar, and green hydrogen projects. The United States boosted funding for biofuels and expanded domestic oil extraction. China, pragmatic as ever, chose to invest in everything simultaneously: oil, coal, renewables, and nuclear energy. This new configuration created an unusual reality. On one side, oil remained absolutely essential to keep the world running. On the other, the race for energy independence had never been more aggressive. The result was a global energy market that became more fragmented, more competitive, and far less predictable. Yet, at the heart of all this transformation, one truth remained unchanged. Whoever controlled oil still held the upper hand in the global game. And the decisions made in 2023 and 2024 would not just shape the next decade. They could very well determine the entire balance of power for the 21st century. Few people truly understood the depth of this shift. To the average citizen, it was just another spike in gas prices. But to top investors, governments, and military strategists, it was the beginning of a new era of silent battles, where every drop of oil carried more than just energy. It carried power. And as the energy race intensified, old alliances started to crumble. New partnerships emerged. And the old world order, once seen as unshakable, began to crack in ways few could have imagined. As the energy crisis deepened, long-standing alliances began to show signs of strain. The United States, historically close to Saudi Arabia, was now facing a new kind of tension. On one side, Washington demanded increased oil production to help ease global inflation. On the other, Riyadh, confident in its renewed leverage, refused to give in easily, pursuing its own long-term strategic interests. The decades-old relationship, built on oil in exchange for military protection, suddenly felt less solid. Saudi Arabia was increasingly investing in strategic agreements with China, expanding trade relations with Russia, and strengthening its position as an independent power. It was no longer just an energy supplier for the West. It had become a sovereign player, capable of setting its own terms. China, in turn, capitalized on the West's vulnerability. It ramped up bilateral oil and gas contracts, strengthened ties with Iran, Russia, and emerging energy-rich nations. In exchange for stable access to resources, it offered investments in infrastructure, technology, and diplomatic support, positioning itself as the alternative global partner. Caught in the middle of this new geopolitical board, Europe faced a tough dilemma. After the energy shock caused by the war in Ukraine, European nations were scrambling for alternatives to reduce their dependence on traditional suppliers. But the reality was harsh. Renewables still couldn't meet full demand. The need for oil and gas, even temporarily, kept the continent exposed to external pressure. While these major shifts unfolded, the global financial market felt the ripple effects. Oil price volatility hit stock exchanges, currencies, and large-scale investments. Energy-linked companies saw profits skyrocket, while sectors dependent on transportation and logistics struggled. For sharp investors, it was a landscape of risk and reward. For governments, it became a race against time. What few realized was that this silent war for energy control wasn't just a contest between nations. It was a battle to dominate the future. Whoever secures stable and affordable energy access in the coming years will hold the key to setting the tone for global economic growth, political influence, and military power. And like every great shift in history, those who move first, and move smart, will reap the biggest rewards. Because while many are still debating what already happened, the real winners are positioning themselves for what comes next. While the major powers fought for influence and access to energy resources, a silent transformation was unfolding on another front: the repositioning of global currencies. Oil, historically traded in US dollars, has long been one of the key reasons behind the dollar's dominance in international trade. But now, with the energy market becoming more fragmented, that supremacy was beginning to be challenged. China and Russia, leaders of emerging alternative blocs, ramped up efforts to close oil and gas deals using local currencies like the yuan and the ruble. Beijing introduced oil futures contracts denominated in yuan, offering a direct alternative to the dollar. At the same time, new economic alliances like the BRICS began seriously discussing the creation of financial instruments to reduce reliance on the US dollar. Though still gradual, this movement carries deep implications. If that demand fractures, America's economic influence could face long-term consequences. And with it, the global balance of power would begin to shift. Inside the United States, strategists and analysts raised warnings about a potential multipolar energy world, a scenario where oil would no longer be just a vital commodity, but also a tool for monetary and geopolitical realignment. That possibility sparked internal debates about the urgency of reinforcing traditional alliances, investing heavily in domestic production, and fast-tracking leadership in clean energy technologies. In the Middle East, momentum was also building. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, though still closely tied to the dollar for practical reasons, began quietly exploring the idea of diversifying their trade and monetary partnerships. After all, relying solely on a single power in an increasingly competitive world had become a strategic risk. What was at stake wasn't just gas prices or export revenues. It was the very architecture of the international financial system. And as history has shown time and again, the most profound changes always begin in silence, long before they become visible to the public eye. The world was witnessing a quiet redrawing of economic forces, one that, for those able to see beyond the headlines, revealed a rare opportunity to understand where true power is headed in the coming decades. But as this shift unfolded, another, even more intense battle was already brewing behind the scenes of the global energy market. A battle that would define not just the next few years, but the direction of the entire 21st century. Behind the scenes of the global energy market, the real battle was already underway. It was no longer just a war over oil. It had become a fight for influence, control, and survival in a rapidly changing world. As oil reclaimed its status as a key asset of power, private companies, investment funds, state-run conglomerates, and governments all ramped up their strategies. Some bet heavily on newly discovered oil fields in Africa. Others poured resources into technologies to make extraction cheaper and more efficient. Major powers financed massive energy infrastructure projects in strategic regions, trading long-term control for upfront investment. The geopolitics of oil was no longer a regional issue. It had evolved into a truly global game, where every barrel, every contract, and every billion-dollar deal became a piece in a much bigger competition for dominance. Meanwhile, the transition to renewable energy continued, but at a pace that mainly benefited a handful of countries. For most of the world, dependence on oil remained an unavoidable reality, and those who secured privileged access to black gold would dominate the map of economic influence for decades to come. OPEC+, fully aware of its renewed leverage, made it clear that it would not hesitate to use production cuts as a geopolitical bargaining tool. Russia, under heavy sanctions, strengthened alternative energy alliances. China secured and expanded long-term supply agreements, and the United States, despite its massive domestic production, realized that the battle for global leadership would be far longer and more complex than anticipated. What we are witnessing today is only the beginning of a global reconfiguration, a silent, yet powerful shift, one where oil has returned to the center of the game. And those who recognize the signs early will position themselves ahead of one of the greatest economic transformations in recent history. In a world where true power isn't shouted from podiums, but whispered behind closed doors, Understanding these moves isn't just an advantage, it's a necessity. If you want to keep following these invisible shifts that shape the future of money and power, make sure to subscribe to Fortune Flow. Here, you'll see what few ever notice, and you'll always stay one step ahead.